shared, and the reason for that is it's really important, as you hear throughout this session. There's a lot of context that goes alongside the slides, which is really important to make sure messages land as I intend them to land. So that's the reason they're not being shared. If there's anything particular that you want, or there's a figure or something that would be really helpful for your work, then you can let Sophie know, and I'll see what I can do. But that's the rationale behind it. Okay, I'm going to get rid of my microphone now. Not my microphone, my camera. Right, let's get going. Okay, let me just get things sorted this end. Okay. Sophie, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can indeed.
Right, okay. So, as I've said, just thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you all this afternoon. It's a real privilege to get the opportunity to talk to teachers and leaders in the wider science education community. So thank you for your time. My name is Jasper Green. I'm part of Ofsted's curriculum unit. So I work part-time in the curriculum unit and also part-time as an HMI in the London region. Okay, so this is a plan for this evening. I'm going to give some general context, thinking about some of the aims of science education. I'm also going to touch on some of the areas of the education inspection framework. I'm then going to provide a bit more detail about the Science Research Review that was published in April 2021. I'm then going to take you through some examples to illustrate some of the key principles from the review. And at the end of this presentation, hopefully there'll be at least 20, maybe more minutes for you to ask me any questions about the contents of this presentation or the Science Research Review that you would like clarified. So please, if anything's unclear, don't hesitate to let me know. Okay, so I'm going to start with what I think is a really important question, which is, what do we want to achieve in science education? And I'm using the word we here on purpose, and that's because schools, exam boards, publishers, Ofsted, and many other organisations all form part of a system. And it's this system really that needs to work together productively if we want to achieve ambitious goals for all young people. I think when we think about what it is we want to achieve for young people, I think the national curriculum is actually quite a good starting point for thinking about the aims of a science education. And I'll just put them up on the screen. I'm sure these you all have seen these before, but I think it's worth just taking a minute or two now just to familiarise yourself with these. Okay, so there are three really ambitious aims here. One is around developing conceptual understanding through the specific disciplines of biology, chemistry and physics. The other is developing an understanding of the nature, processes and methods of science, and these are outlined often in the Working Scientifically sections of the national curriculum. And then we've got the last one, which is really making sure pupils have necessary knowledge to understand the uses and implications of science today and for the future. And I think the pandemic has really shone a spotlight to the importance of science education in that area. I think it's worth stressing really that these are aims for all pupils, and that's always the hard part, because no matter what we do in science education, it will work for some pupils for sure, but it's working for all pupils that's the really difficult question really. And absolutely, pupils need to develop a love of this subject. And this is captured in the national curriculum in terms of developing a sense of excitement and curiosity about natural phenomena. But there can be no shortcuts to developing pupils' appreciation and knowledge of science. So, for example, pupils taking part in already interesting activities like this, without a rigorous focus on scientific content, is not going to develop a lifelong love of appreciation of science. Pupils enjoy this already without any understanding of science. So I think the question is, what makes something scientific? Similarly, memorising disconnected lists of facts is not going to help pupils to build scientific knowledge either. And the education inspection framework is absolutely clear on this, and this is taken from paragraph 210, from the Section 5 handbook. And it says inspectors will be alert to unnecessary or excessive attempts to simply prompt pupils to learn glossaries or long lists of disconnected facts. So I think it's important to recognise instead that developing expertise in science takes time. And really it's about pupils building complex webs of knowledge, often referred to as schemas or schemata. So as pupils learn content in science, they build increasingly sophisticated knowledge of key concepts and procedures, which together enable scientific understanding. So, pupils will start off learning about ecosystems when they learn about food chains, and they'll build upon this when they learn about plant adaptations and animal nutrition. It's these concepts that give pupils the capacity to generalise and to explain the material world and to solve interesting problems with ease. And it's these concepts that ultimately are the goals of science education, because it's the concepts that pupils will leave school with. As part of our review of research for the research review, it was clear that actually these ambitious aims are not realised for all pupils. So what I'm going to do is show you now some data from Year 6 sampling tests. So these are tests that are sat by Year 6 pupils every 2 years, and they're issued by government. And they're assessments that assess biology, chemistry, physics, and working scientifically. A sample of around 8,000 pupils do them, and the purpose of the national sample test is really to monitor standards over time, since the Year 6 assessments or external assessments have been removed from science. So they're a sort of a check, if you like, to see how pupils are doing based on examinations. So I'll show you the results from 2018, and you can also see 2016 here. So if we look at the slide, just under 25% of pupils were estimated to be achieving the expected standard in science at the end of Year 6. If we look at pupils who are eligible for free school meals, this drops to just over 9%. So you can see that the vast majority of pupils are leaving Year 6 without reaching the expected standard in science. Now, the next tests were due to be 2020. That didn't take place because of COVID, so the next sample assessments will be 2022. We also know that in 2019, data from TIMSS, which is a large international comparison test, showed pupils' performance in science decreased significantly in England compared with 2015, and I'll show you that now. So it is now significantly lower than in any previous TIMSS cycle. And I think of particular concern is the widening gap between the highest and lowest performing Year 9 pupils in science. The proportion of pupils performing below the lowest TIMSS science benchmark has doubled since 2015. Now, as I alluded to at the beginning, it's important to stress that there's no sort of single cause for this decline. Rather, there are many factors here involving many organisations, and it's going to involve a whole systems approach to address this decline. It's also worth recognising that despite this fall, England still remains well above TIMSS scale centre point. And this is true in both Year 9 and Year 5. So the question is then, based on the data I presented to you, how can we ensure that all pupils develop expertise in science and ensure it's not just left for the lucky few? And I think this involves real careful thought about three distinct but related areas. The first is the curriculum. So this is the planned journey, if you like, that identifies what content pupils learn. And this needs to take account of what knowledge pupils bring with them from previous phase of schooling. And then we've got pedagogy. That is how the curriculum is taught, so pupils can build and apply that knowledge skillfully. And then finally, assessment. And that is to help pupils embed and use knowledge fluently, but also to check their understanding to inform teaching. Ofsted refers to curriculum as an intent, and pedagogy and assessment as implementation. I think it's interesting just to pause for a minute and reflect about where the focus has been in the past in science education research. And I think the vast majority of it has been around pedagogy and some around assessment. There's been very little thought given to curriculum, and as I'll outline in this presentation, actually curriculum thinking is fundamental here. So intent, implementation and impact form the basis through which inspectors reach a single quality of education judgment. So I'll just give you a minute to familiarise yourself with these three areas. Okay, so intent here is much more than any vision or rationale. Okay, it's about what pupils are learning. So the names and functions of different parts of flowering plants, the life cycle of a mammal or the unit of temperature. It's the what. And a school's curriculum intent must be as least ambitious as the national curriculum and designed to give all pupils, particularly the most disadvantaged and those with special educational needs, the knowledge they need to succeed in life. So the 3I division, the intent, implementation, impact, is just a useful way of thinking about quality of education, but it's important to stress that this is not meant to be any sort of management structure in a school. And the real take-home is the distinction between curriculum, that is intent, from implementation, which is pedagogy. So in order to reach their judgment about quality of education, inspectors carry out so-called deep dives. And they'll do this in a number of subjects. And what they do is really they explore, initially with subject leader, the curriculum intent. So that's really trying to understand the school's curriculums. So what are pupils learning when? What's the rationale behind some of the sequencing that's been decided? And then inspectors, after their discussion with subject leaders, and once they've understood the curriculum intent, they'll then visit lessons to sort of see that intent enacted. They'll speak with teachers to find out some of the rationale behind the decisions that they took in the classroom, and they'll speak to pupils to find out what they know and remember. And they'll also look at their work scrutiny to see how the curriculum has been developed over time. It's important to stress that the order of activities as seen on this slide might be slightly different. So, it's possible that inspectors might speak with pupils, for example, before teachers. But what's really important is this sort of represented by this yellow line here is the connectedness of evidence. So what inspectors are looking for, they're gathering connected evidence so they can identify what is systemic in a subject. It's important to stress inspectors will not grade lessons, and they will not grade individual subjects, and they will not request materials to be produced or provided in any specific format for inspection. Okay, so I've given a bit of an overview in terms of quality of education in general terms. Let's take a closer look now at the Science Research Review and consider what features are associated with high quality science education. So the Science Research Review, it was published in April 2021. It's available online, and I hope some of you have had a chance to read it. The review was really a collaboration between Ofsted's curriculum unit and our research and evaluation team. And it set out really to outline a concept of quality in relation to science education. I'm just going to show you there the key sections, and the document is hyperlinked, so it can be easily you can read it in sections, which makes it a bit easier because it is quite a long document. So we've got curriculum, pedagogy, assessment, and school systems. And these are all areas really that align to those of the education inspection framework when we think about quality of education. At this point, I want to be really clear about what the research review is not. So it's absolutely not a checklist of things inspectors look for. In other words, it's not a second framework. Inspectors will not be coming into departments and ticking off aspects from the Science Research Review. Schools are judged on the education inspection framework. And it's not a document that covers all areas of science education. That would have been too broad in scope, and would have meant we would have to have done everything at a very shallow level. So, for example, we did not look at science clubs, but just because they are not included in the review does not mean these aspects are not hugely important. So what does the research review do then? Well, as I've said earlier, it does identify features associated with high quality science education. And it certainly recognises that there is not just one way of achieving high quality, and that's outlined explicitly in the introduction. But it does identify a number of principles that guide how inspectors look at what they see. And I'm just going to sort of illustrate what I mean by that in a second. Imagine an inspector is, she's had her meeting with the curriculum leader, and now she's visiting some lessons. One of the lessons is taking place outdoors and is a practical lesson. So the question is, well, what is the inspector thinking about when she's in that lesson? Well, based on our research review, we know that a lot of practical work is actually ineffective in helping pupils to learn science. And research has been clear on that for a long time. So she'll be thinking about, well, what does research say are the features associated with high-quality practical work? Well, she wants to know, what is the purpose of the practical in relation to what pupils are learning? Because research says that where purpose is clear, practical work is much more effective. They'll be interested, she'll be interested to know whether pupils can connect, the scientific theory to what they're doing. So are they able to link the concepts, for example, that they've learnt about to maybe the procedures that they're carrying out? We know that children find that very difficult, and a lot of practical work is where pupils are able to describe what they're doing, but they're not able to explain the science behind it. Should be looking to see what pupils know and do already. For example, if they're using a particular piece of apparatus, or that they're asking questions that show a level of understanding about a particular concept. All of those will be evidence of curricular impact. And she'll be interested to know where this practical activity sits. Does it simply, is it a one-off standalone activity, or does it fit as a sequence of lessons? So it's part of a wider instructional sequence. So that sort of exemplifies how this guidance is going to be used to support inspection practice. I'm now going to just outline in a bit more detail some specific examples which I hope are useful to illustrate key principles from the review. There's always a danger when we share examples, and that the examples become something that Ofsted so-called wants to see. And I want to really dispel that myth. These examples here are just chosen because I hope they are useful in illustrating a principle, not because they're something that Ofsted will want to see during an inspection. The education inspection framework is quite clear on how it defines progress. So it defines progress in that progress is when pupils know more, remember more, and are able to do more. Okay? In other words, they are learning what the curriculum planned them to learn. And you might hear or have heard this idea that the curriculum is the progression model. In other words, what it means is that pupils make progress when they learn what was intended as set out in the school science curriculum. So this begs the question then, well, if progress is knowing more, remembering more, and doing more, what does that mean for science? Because to make progress in science is very different than it is to make progress in English or art, for example. So I'm going to try and illustrate that now by drawing on ideas from the review. And to do that, I'm going to start with a scientific question. So what is it that a pupil will need to know in order to answer this question? Well, to answer this scientific question, pupils will need knowledge of plants, they'll need knowledge of animals, and they may need knowledge of adaptation. This knowledge will not allow a pupil to determine if that is a plant or not, because they'll see that actually this organism has features of both. So to come to a decision, they will really need to understand some principles of biological classification. because it was through biological classification that scientists arrive at deciding whether something is an animal or a plant. So, in order to answer a scientific question, pupils need knowledge, what we term substantive knowledge in the review. That's the knowledge produced by science. So, for example, the concept of a flower, the theory of evolution, or knowing about the particle model, that they would be examples of substantive knowledge. And this is referred to as conceptual understanding in the national curriculum. But they will also need to know disciplinary knowledge. That is knowing how science establishes and refines scientific knowledge. So in this example, it was knowledge of classification, but it might be knowledge of variable, measurement, evidence, and presenting scientific data. And this is outlined in the working scientific sections of the national curriculum. Now, the way I presented that previously was a bit misleading because I presented substantive and disciplinary knowledge as separate. But actually there is a real interplay between both categories of knowledge. And in other words, disciplinary and substantive knowledge have an effect on each other. Now, this is a bit abstract, so I'm going to try and explain, and I hope it is clear. But if we take disciplinary knowledge of classification, well, you can't teach disciplinary knowledge of classification in the abstract. It must be connected to something substantive, because to classify plants scientifically requires different knowledge than to classify animals scientifically. So this means that disciplinary knowledge of classification always needs to be specified in the curriculum in relation to substantive content. There is an interplay between knowledge of classification and substantive knowledge. There's also sort of another relationship working the other way, that substantive knowledge gets its meaning from disciplinary knowledge. So to truly understand what a mammal is, you really need to know about biological classification. Because it was this method of organisation that has allowed biologists to call things mammals. If pupils don't connect substantive knowledge of animals to the disciplinary knowledge of classification, they don't really know what an animal is. And this can cause misconceptions too. So, for example, pupils may think that ducks are birds and not animals. They think that because they actually haven't got an understanding of how scientists go about classifying the world. Now, this doesn't mean that substantive and disciplinary knowledge must always be taught together. However, the science curriculum needs to be planned so that pupils learn how the two forms of knowledge connect in science. So it may, of course, be appropriate to teach substantive or disciplinary knowledge by itself, especially at the beginning when pupils are first learning ideas. But it needs to be planned so that over time people see the connection between the two. So making progress then involves pupils knowing more and remembering more about substantive knowledge. So that's the knowledge produced by science, typically referred to as conceptual understanding. But also disciplinary knowledge. What pupils need to know about how science establishes and refines scientific knowledge. And this is outlined in the working scientifically sections of the national curriculum. Now, that exclamation mark really is just to remind me to say that these are terms, these are essentially curricular terms that are helpful when designing curriculum, but they're not terms that Ofsted would expect subject leaders or teachers to use. We're simply using them really to identify two sort of key strands ultimately of a curriculum that is helpful to think about when planning for progression in science. Now, later on in the presentation, I'll explore a little bit more detail about why we use the term disciplinary knowledge in the review, but for now I'll just leave it at that. Okay, so let's have a little look now in more detail about how a curriculum might plan for pupils to build their substantive knowledge. So as I've said already, a major goal of science education really is to develop pupils' knowledge of key substantive concepts, such as force, inheritance, materials, and substance. So it's these concepts, together with disciplinary knowledge, that enable people to reason scientifically about the world around them. And, it's helpful, I think, to think about them as the tools of thought, if you like. And when thinking about progression in substantive knowledge, we can think about it in two key respects. The first is extent, so that's knowing more about that concept. So if we take forces, there might be more examples of forces you know. There might be more equations that you can use. Also want to think about it in relation to organisation. So it's not just knowing more about a concept, but it's knowing about how concepts are related to each other. So we think about progression in substantive knowledge, we're thinking about progression in relation to these two aspects. So I think, I'm going to try and sort of outline that in a bit more detail, thinking about how a curriculum might plan for pupils to build their knowledge of matter throughout their time at school. So the boxes represent possible topic headings that I found in the national curriculum, and these are topics that pupils may learn about when studying about matter. And you can look back into the early years foundation stage framework and actually find that pupils are introduced to a range of phenomena and vocabulary that are relevant for building their knowledge of matter in Key Stage 1 and beyond. And so within each of these topics, or you may refer to them as units, sit content. So knowing the names of materials and their specific properties, for example. And it's by learning this content that pupils build their knowledge of important concepts. So in this case, if we imagine a pupil travelling through this curriculum, starting right in the early years and moving on to Key Stage 4, they will build a knowledge of at least three essential concepts. So substance to state change, material and chemical changes. Now different people would identify different key concepts to develop, but I think what's important is there is clarity around what the key concepts pupils are developing. And so repeated encounters with the same concept, but in different contexts, builds progressively more sophisticated schemata. So, in year 4, you're building on what pupils have learned previously in the early years around states of matter, and even you're linking to materials in year 1, and that will be built on again in Key Stage 3. So I think the point I'm trying to stress is that the key concepts are returned to again and again and again, but in progressively more sophisticated ways. But I hope some of you are witnessing at my model here of buckets filling up with knowledge as pupils move through the curriculum, because this model, like all models, is only showing one aspect. That's showing the extent of knowledge as pupils travel through the curriculum. But really, what we're most interested in, or not most, but also interested in, is pupils building relationships. So I referred to this as pupils are building trees. So as pupils move through the curriculum, not only are they learning more about these concepts, but they're actually learning about how the concepts relate to each other. So, for example, they know how a material is different from an object, and that materials can be mixtures or substances. So the curriculum needs to be organised so pupils not only build knowledge of concepts, but also learn how the concepts are related. And so, a carefully sequenced curriculum really makes sure that pupils learn content in a sensible and logical order. And in this example, I think it illustrates that pupils really need to understand about substance before learning about chemical reactions and using formulae. So, if I was to ask you then which scheme, 1 or 2, came from a well-organised curriculum, well, obviously we can't see schema directly in children's minds, but we could try and ask them to draw a sort of a concept diagram. And the question is, well, which one came from a well-organised curriculum? Well, of course we can't tell, because even with a well-sequenced and organised curriculum, pupils will learn different things from that was intended, and that's why formative assessment is so important. However, I think it's important to recognise that with a well-sequenced curriculum, with sufficient time for practice and feedback, pupils are much more likely to arrive at a coherent understanding. So, number 1. And importantly, when you've got a clear sense of a progression map, it really allows teachers, I think, to have a much clearer idea of what pupils should be able to know and do at various stages, and allowing responsive teaching and careful feedback to take place. I think when thinking about progression and curricular design, it's important to specify intent at the right level of detail. So from that same sequence where pupils were learning about matter, this could be a general intent statement in the curriculum. But the problem with general intent statements like this is it leaves you with questions, well, which materials are they learning about? Which properties are they learning and why? And that might seem an unimportant question, but they are important questions when you recognise that actually knowledge has a function on future learning. So depending on what materials they learn about, that might make future learning easier or harder and may decrease the likelihood of misconceptions forming. So by being clear on exactly what pupils are learning, you're able to select the best content for pupils to learn at specific points. So I'm going to give you an example here that we drew on in the review. So I'm going to show you now two statements about matter and materials that were taken from a curriculum. I'll just put them up the slide. I'll let you read those. Now, the first point to make is that both Statement 1 and Statement 2 are technically correct. However, if pupils learn the first statement, they then go on to believe that the world really is made from solids, liquids and gases, and that gas particles are somehow different to solid particles. And this can then encourage misconceptions, for example, thinking that gases don't have a mass. In contrast, if pupils learn the second statement, i.e. learn about substances before learning about solids, liquids and gases, they're more likely to make sense of the idea that gases have a mass, that carbon dioxide is not a gas. So, you ask many pupils, is carbon dioxide a gas? They'll say yes. Of course, it's not a gas. It's a gas at room temperature. And so by starting pupils' understanding of matter thinking very much about substances, that can play an important role in making future learning easier and misconceptions less likely. So the take home really from this slide is that by thinking carefully about what pupils learn when, it can make future learning either easier or harder and increase or decrease the likelihood of misconceptions. Okay, so now let's take a bit of time to think about progression in disciplinary knowledge. And again, I'm going to draw upon ideas from our review here. The first question is, well, why have we used the term disciplinary knowledge and not scientific skills or working scientifically in our review? And I want to be really clear that absolutely scientific skills such as evaluating evidence, presenting scientific data and carrying out investigations are absolutely vital goals of science education. However, if a curriculum is going to help pupils to reach these goals, then it needs to identify the components. In other words, whilst we might value a particular scientific skill, in order for us to plan for how pupils will acquire that skill, we need to think about the components. In other words, we need to take that scientific skill and break it down into knowledge. In the review, we term this disciplinary knowledge. By identifying the components, we can then think about how they will be sequenced over time in the curriculum, so that as pupils travel through the curriculum, they build progressively more sophisticated disciplinary knowledge. So the temptation when thinking about scientific skills, for example, graphing skills, is to simply practice the skill. But practicing the skill will not enable all pupils to get better at it. But by taking the skill and breaking it down into components, which we've termed disciplinary knowledge, it's then possible to be clear about what it is pupils are learning, so there is clarity in what you're teaching and assessing. Now, the use of the term disciplinary knowledge in the review does not preclude other ways of thinking about progression in relation to the nature, methods, and processes of science. I think what matters is that the curriculum intentionally plans for how pupils' knowledge of scientific inquiry advances over time. It does not assume that pupils will learn about the nature, methods, and processes of science simply by taking part in practical activities. In other words, disciplinary knowledge needs to be explicitly taught. So I can sort of explore this a little bit further by thinking of what is in some ways a simple example, but there's more to it than meets the eye. So if we think about the skill of using a thermometer, and I asked you to think about what is all the knowledge pupils need to know in able to use a thermometer and make a list, and you could do that for maybe a pupil in year 6 or year 11. What would they need to know? And by doing that, we suddenly realise that actually beneath what can be quite a simple skill of using a thermometer sits an enormous amount of disciplinary knowledge. So I'm just going to show you now some of the knowledge that I identified that pupils will need to know, and this is really looking towards the end of year 11. Some of these will be certainly relevant for primary. What we can see is that beneath a complex skill of using a thermometer sits a lot of procedures, so things we want pupils to be able to do, but also concepts. So it's absolutely critical to see that actually behind a lot of disciplinary knowledge sit concepts. And we can unpack that a little bit more in another representation. So here we have a composite using a thermometer skillfully, and a composite is just another word for a complex skill. And then we've broken it down into components that pupils need, the disciplinary knowledge that pupils need in order to be able to use a thermometer. And then we can think about, well, which ones are concepts and which ones are procedures. That might be helpful in planning the best teaching approach. And we can also recognise that some of these components might be best taught away from the distractions of apparatus in the beginning. So you may, for example, decide to teach pupils how to read a scale without going anywhere near a thermometer in the beginning stages. And once you have identified the components like this behind any complex disciplinary skill, it's possible to then sequence that in your curriculum over time. So in our previous example, this enables pupils to develop knowledge of thermometer and measurement, but it could be used to illustrate any specific aspect of disciplinary knowledge. So it's quite a complex slide, but this slide really just represents a simplified version of a curriculum. We might have chemistry, physics, and biology, key concepts, and these are simply identifying when they're taught. But what I want to try and model really is, once we've identified a particular aspect of disciplinary knowledge, we can then define where it's going to be first taught and introduced. So, for example, in year 3 here, it might be where pupils first learn how to use a thermometer, and they might do that measuring the temperature of the human body. Here they'll learn a simple scale, but they'll also learn about standard units and the importance of time taken to reach a temperature. But that knowledge is not forgotten. It's built upon in year 4, when pupils then learn about reading scales with negative numbers, for example, when they're looking at the melting points of different substances. And then again in year 5, it's built on again, where pupils may use a thermometer to monitor temperature over time as a control variable when investigating properties of insulators. So, I think to recap, pupils are not simply using a thermometer again and again, rather the curriculum is being explicit about what it is pupils are learning about and how that advances over time. And you can apply this principle, as I said, to any other aspect of disciplinary knowledge. Okay, so in the review we identify 4 possible aspects of disciplinary knowledge that you might want to think about when planning for progression of disciplinary knowledge over time. And we've got knowledge of scientific methods. So I'll put some examples to clarify what I mean here. Knowledge of apparatus and techniques. Knowledge of data analysis and presentation. And then knowledge of how science uses evidence to develop explanations. So really the point of specifying those four aspects was really to focus in on what are the areas that you might plan for progression over time. And the triangle there is to make it really clear that these four areas were used in the review, but they're not the only four areas that you could think about, and they're not areas that inspectors would expect schools to use. Okay, so I'm now going to quickly share some of the other key findings from the pedagogy, assessment and systems sections of the review. So one thing that strongly came across in the research was the importance of clear teacher explanations. And indeed, in a recent survey, pupils identified teacher explanations as the most important thing science teachers do to help them learn science. I think that's not surprising when you think about some of the complexity involved in learning the abstract scientific ideas. In the review, we talk about the importance of practical work, and I think it's really important to be clear on why that is. Well, I think practical work introduces pupils to the objects, phenomena and methods of study. But as I said at the beginning, research is clear that a lot of practical work is ineffective in helping pupils to learn the science concepts. And so we look at ways to make sure that pupils can learn from practical work, so making sure they have enough prior knowledge to learn, making sure there's clarity around purpose, and that it forms part of a wider instructional sequence. So that's just recapping what we looked at earlier in relation to the inspector. We identified the important role for textbooks in terms of supporting pupils, but also teachers. So we know that sometimes textbooks are not helpful if they become overly connected to the exam, but high quality textbooks provide a really rich source for pupils to read non-fiction texts, get access to really high quality explanations, and also opportunity for sustained practice. We talk about the importance of disciplinary knowledge being explicitly taught. In other words, not simply expecting pupils to acquire disciplinary knowledge just by doing a practical. So when you think about important concepts like error or repeatability, those concepts need to be taught. It can't just be assumed pupils will learn them through carrying out practical work. And we talk about the importance of distinguishing between learning about scientific inquiry, in other words, learning disciplinary knowledge, and not confuse that with inquiry-based teaching approaches, which are pedagogical approaches. So learning about scientific inquiry is a curricular goal. Inquiry-based teaching approaches are a pedagogy. In terms of time, I'm going to move through these slides now, but I will come back to them if anyone wants further clarification about the difference between inquiry based teaching approaches and knowledge of scientific inquiry. So in terms of systems then, research was clear that high quality subject specific CPD is critical for both teachers and technicians. And in our review, we also focused on the importance of developing teachers' disciplinary knowledge about the nature of science and its methods. And I think it's interesting, perhaps we wrongly assume that just because we've graduated in a science degree, we have an understanding of how science as a discipline works. And I think that isn't, based on the research, always the case. We identified the importance of subject leaders having dedicated time to lead the subjects, and that's particularly apparent at primary school, where often that isn't the case. There was some interesting research that looked at how science and maths leaders work together to plan out their curriculum. So it's important that pupils can see the connectedness between science and maths, but schools should not assume that curriculum planning will take account of what goes on in each department. And that's really to do with the asymmetry, because whilst it's in the you take a head of science in a secondary school, it's in their interest to work with the maths department. However, it's not really in the maths department interest to work with science. That asymmetry is important to recognise, and therefore collaboration won't take place unless SLT or senior leaders directly sort of ensure that it does. And also linked to that is the difficulty pupils have to take what they've learnt in maths and apply it in a science context. And really, pupils need a lot of support to carry out mathematical procedures in their science classes. And that will often involve explicit teaching of the maths by the science teacher. We looked at the research that really recognised that science teachers are more likely to leave the profession than any other. And one way to try and address this was to actually give early career teachers sympathetic timetables. In other words, rather than teaching across all three sciences and across multiple key stages, they might be given one science to teach, for example, or a fewer number of year groups. And that allows teachers to develop expertise, but it also helps to manage workload. And we also look at the importance of curriculum time. So in primary, for example, we know that some schools do not have enough time to teach an ambitious science curriculum. And in secondary, there can be problems around triple science where there is insufficient time allocated to triple science to take account of the fact it's worth 3 GCSEs. And that can have affect often disadvantaged pupils who are not able to cope with a shorter amount of time to teach the more demanding content in. And we look at the importance of practical resources. So where there is insufficient practical resources, what can happen is pupils take part in practical work, but in overly large groups. So actually they aren't themselves getting first-hand experiences of the various procedures or concepts they're learning about. So in terms of assessment then, the review flagged the importance of being clear on its purpose, so as learning, for learning, or of learning, and I bolded of learning there, that sort of summative assessment, because there is indication that there is insufficient assessment of learning going on in primary, but actually in secondary there can be an overemphasis on summative assessment. This links really to what I talked earlier about the importance of teacher knowledge for teaching science, but where subject knowledge is not always confident, feedback can be focused on generic features such as handwriting. And that really high quality assessment needs to be focused on the science content. With any type of assessment, there's always a risk it will become overly burdensome on teachers' time, and so we look at that in the review. And we also flag some of the challenges of overusing external assessment items. So, for example, GCSE questions which are inappropriate, appearing too early on in a child's education, where these are really meant to assess pupils at the edge at the end of year 11. Okay, so we've covered everything we needed to, and I just want to recap then with where we've got to. So, the Science Research Review, as I've said, identifies features associated with high-quality science education. It's not a tick list, and it's not something inspectors are going to use to judge the quality of education. What I haven't said is about the subject report. So what we will do is next year, in the spring, hopefully in the spring, we will publish a subject report for science, which will outline what inspectors have found about how science is taught in England schools. So that hopefully will be a useful report for the sector, which will identify really what's going on in relation to science education in England schools. I'm going to leave you really just with 3 questions for you to consider as you reflect on your own science curriculum. So the first one is, does your curriculum plan for all pupils to build knowledge of key substantive concepts over time? Is there clarity in what the concepts are? Does it plan for pupils to build their disciplinary knowledge over time? And that includes disciplinary concepts. And is there careful thought to what disciplinary knowledge is taught when? And are activities carefully chosen to help pupils learn specific curriculum content? So it's very much that third point is starting very much with the intent, what it is you want pupils to learn, and then making sure that the pedagogies are matched to the intent. In other words, I think you could sum up those three questions, which is, does the curriculum systematically plan for pupils to be successful in science? Okay, so we've reached the end. I'm just going to really hand over to you now and ask if anyone has any specific questions about the contents of this presentation or the Science Research Review. Okay. Right. Okay, so I'm just getting back. Okay, so we've got one question. So if maybe we'll give everyone a bit of time. Let's just say 2 minutes. Have a think if there's any questions you want. The review is online if you want to have a quick look at it, and then we'll come back together. And then if you're happy, I'll ask you to put your camera on to ask the question, so we can have a bit of a discussion around it. So we'll come back together in 2 minutes. Okay, so if everyone got access to the bar?
We even have the option to watch Peppa Pig, should we wish.
I know, I can see that. I mean, I'm competing with Peppa Pig here. I mean, I'll go with that first question, Bryony, thanks. So really the question was about does the review include details of science for special needs schools? It doesn't. We didn't explicitly do a section on special needs schools. That was potentially one of my, that was an example of an area that we didn't explore. It doesn't mean it wasn't important. I think we do address, we draw upon some research within the review that's specific for pupils with SEND, particularly looking at the importance of chunking, so breaking complex concepts procedures down into smaller parts. Work on there's quite a lot of working memory in the review which would feel relevant. So I think there are most of the principles that we look at would that are beneficial for learning are beneficial for all pupils. I think pupils with SEND need those principles even more, and there's a range of literature throughout that sort of we use to explore that in more detail. Okay. Right, we've had another question. Is it Eloise? Are you able to put your camera on?
Yes, if you can hear me and see me now.
Hi.
Oh, no, there we go. Hi.
Hi.
Do you want me to ask my question?
Yeah, answer your question, thank you.
Okay, so I'm a subject leader in a mixed year group school, so we're a really small school, and we have quite a task to develop a 2-year rolling programme, because obviously we teach the children for 2 years in a row, and obviously you need to teach the progression and the skills in the right order, but we also have to spread it over the 2 years, and we also have 2 year groups in the same class, so trying to make sure the year ones are getting what they need first before they develop into, learning the year 2 skills. So it's just a bit of a challenge. I wondered if you had any advice.
No, so how do you? So you've got 2 year groups together, have you?
Yes.
So like who is it? Year 1 with year 2?
Yeah, I've got year 1 with year 2. Yeah.
And how do you do it at the moment?
So we have a 2-year rolling programme, and we've tried to spread the science out so that we've got equal amount of science in each years, and try to link related topics. So using materials, trying to keep those things are the same, and then animals and their habitats and living things in the other year. But obviously then you've got the different aspects of that and the concepts when you break it down for year 1 and year 2. And I guess as you go through the school as well, it's there's a year 3-4 class, and there's a year 5-6 class, and we're also next year having a reception year 1 mixed class as well. So that's another challenge as well.
Yeah, no, I can see the challenges. So at the moment with the year 1, year 2, do you teach them? Are they all taught together essentially?
Yes.
They're all learning the same thing.
Yeah.
It's challenging. Yeah, I can see the challenge. I think it is about thinking about progression fundamentally.
I use questioning a lot, so that it's obviously then directed to the child and what they need, because obviously sometimes you have year 2s that are working at year 1 level anyway, and that type of thing is what they're working with. But it's mostly verbally that it's, and sometimes resources, but mostly verbally. Yeah.
The other thing I was thinking about was resourcing, but I think you're already thinking of those things. I think it's a really good question, and I want to think a bit more about it. Are you in contact with Sophie?
Is that the person who sent us the email with the link? Then yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I will get back in touch with Sophie, because I think it's a really good question that I want to think about a bit more before I give you an answer that isn't clear and useful.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Jay, do you want to ask that question? That's a good question.
Hi there. Just thinking about lots of schools doing the same things, whether or not that chunking, that decision-making process on what you would determine to be the knowledge base compared to disciplinary knowledge, has that, has it already been done, not want to just sound like someone who's avoiding work, but just to get clarity within the educational community, really, is what I was thinking. We're scientists, and that peer review, also as head of science, my discipline is physics, and I have support from my teachers, of course, but in humility I realise there may be people like yourself and others who have already had a bite of the cherry, and is that information out there, and we should just go for it.
Yeah. Are you secondary, Jay?
Yes.
Yeah, secondary physics. So I think so the national curriculum is certainly a good starting point, but it is obviously quite high level. So I mean, there'll be various statements, but then beneath those will sit knowledge that needs to be sort of identified, and I think that's why the national curriculum is not a curriculum, because it doesn't really identify the components. In terms of has that been done, so obviously there's some work that will have been done in the exam board. The specifications will identify some aspects from that that you could think about how they map down appropriately. There are other things that have been done. I think if you look on STEM learning, you might find some resources for sort of mapping scientific skills over time. I think the fundamental piece is, and I don't think it has been done well, or not necessarily well's the wrong word, I don't think that there's not a sort of comprehensive package that provides a really well sequenced disciplinary knowledge sort of progression map, really. And I think what tends to happen, which we were talking about in the review, is it's more about the activities. So we might do a particular practical, or we might draw a particular graph, whereas the components of those needs to be drawn out. So there's no easy message here, I'm afraid.
Should the responsibility, though, be with every single individual school to produce their own, when that clarity around the national curriculum has led to, probably in a good way actually, I think anyway, the exam boards being quite narrow in their differences. So it used to be that the exam boards would offer significantly different buckets, if you will, of knowledge. So some would go more for the space and the universe, and others maybe would go further in terms of forces and the impact and fields. But because of the national curriculum growing in breadth, taking on Key Stage 5 material into Key Stage 4, should the responsibility of the next level be with teachers or those exam boards to differentiate between those two sets of knowledge that you've talked about tonight? Do you think we should just all get on with it, and then, or is there plans afoot for that work to be done?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in that question. I think, firstly, there'll be a lot the schools are doing already in terms of, it's a new term, disciplinary knowledge, but there'll be lots of, depending on your own curriculum, there'll be lots that's in there already. I think the purpose of the key message from the review is the importance to explicitly teach it, and be clear on when it's being taught. It's not necessarily so, for example, when you're teaching particle model, do you spend time thinking about what models are, what scientific models are, how they're used? That would be an example of disciplinary knowledge being taught alongside substantive knowledge, or is it just assumed that they'll somehow pick up what a model is? Yeah. So it's about being explicit. Now that probably is it already in your curriculum, I don't know, but it's about maybe drawing it out and being a bit more explicit about it. So it's not a total rewrite or anything, it's just tweaking. Yeah. I think I personally think that a lot of the curricular thinking does need to sit within the school, and the curriculum is your fundamentally it's your conception. It's the exciting part of leading a department or leading a subject is having that ownership for the curriculum. However, I don't believe that means everything needs to be written from scratch. So I think subject associations and bodies will be able to provide further support over time with clarifying what good progression and disciplinary knowledge looks like. But I don't think there's nothing I can say to you now that if you go to this you'll find it. I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you.
But I think, Jay, the key is a lot of what we're talking about in terms of disciplinary knowledge, substantive knowledge, will already be there, and maybe it's just sort of being a bit more intentional about have I actually mapped out the progression of graph drawing, for example, from year 7 all the way up to year 11.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Okay.
David, did you have your hand up? David Britz Colwill?
Hello, thank you. Yes. I don't know if my camera is actually on. Here we go. My question is actually very similar to one that we're having in the Plymouth Secondary Science Hub meeting recently, and it was part of this review, so I was interested in your thoughts. In Plymouth, and certainly in my own school, there's a huge disparity between, and it's what came out in the report as well, between curriculum hours across our particular the curriculum that we offer. So for subjects like maths, which is, although it's very, very important, and it's obviously double weighted with things like progress rate indicators and things,
Yeah.
it's a single award GCSE at the end of the day, and then we have option subjects which will get a certain number of hours, and then the sciences, especially if it's biology, chemistry, physics, tend to be lumped together as sort of science, and so they look at the number of hours we get and see it as lots rather than looking at it as a divided by 3. I mean, so for our context, it can range from sort of 7 hours across our fortnight for maths, whereas it would be 5 hours across a fortnight for a typical GCSE option. And then it would be 4 hours over a fortnight for a same-sized GCSE in chemistry, say, and biology, physics. So my question is really, is this something that, now that it's part of this research, will it be something that Ofsted are looking at when they go into schools? And if so, would it be? I think it would be helpful if they could support science colleagues and say, as part of the report, it seems that there's not a sort of fairness or a parity here. And will it sort of support science teachers to then be able to bid for more time on the curriculum? Because one thing I always feel deeply about is come results day, when we have all the subjects sort of lined up in terms of how well they've done this year, and we think sort of separately, well, if we had twice the amount of hours we did, we might be able to make a bit more. So I suppose I would be grateful if Ofsted would say, well, it seems your curriculum's a little uneven, maybe that would help you with your outcomes for science. But if that's a focus area, I can see why that might not be, you might not be making so much ground. And the only reason I say this is that as being a practical advisor for AQA in the past, where we visit schools to check on their practical work for the required practical element, we were really mindful of doing that in our reports. If practical work seemed deficient, we willingly say in our reports, it would be great if you could bid for more resources because it would help you do better, and it would be great if Ofsted could do something similar. Anyway, I know that was a long ramble. Thank you.
No, I understand all of that, David. I think it makes perfect sense. So we draw upon research from the learned bodies who commission timetable models to go. Essentially, they went out, as you've alluded to, and identified that science does not get an equal share based on its number of GCSEs. It's always a difficult one because, as you give more to science, you take it has to come from somewhere. So there's always that tension. I think the report, as much as it could be made, has made the point around primary science and around triple, because I think they're examples where there can be real shortfalls, and where there's a shortfall for triple, I think it's certain groups of pupils who are being hit. And I think those are the things that inspectors would be looking at. So if, because you have narrowed the time allocated for something, that means that you're excluding certain pupils from doing something, then that is not all pupils are having access to a curriculum. In terms of how schools are judged, the judgments are made against the education inspection framework. However, as part of a deep dive, inspectors will be exploring, how much curricular time, well, not necessarily how much curricular time, but we'll be exploring the curriculum and whether it is ambitious or not. So if the curricular time has narrowed, which means that schools can't offer an ambitious curriculum, for example, there's not enough time for practical work, that would be an issue, because in that deep dive, because pupils are not having sufficient time to access an ambitious curriculum. So I think it's not just one thing, because there are you could have a slightly narrower curriculum, a slightly smaller time for science, but actually pupils are doing really well and flourishing in that, and there are ways the school has got around it. But I think fundamentally the questions you're asking is there an ambitious curriculum in place? Is this open for all pupils? Is there time for pupils to learn what's taught? Are pupils making progress over time? Are they remembering more and knowing more? And if there are problems that pupils aren't, for example, remembering more and being able to do more, then you would explore why not. And you may land that one of the reasons is that it's just insufficient time. So that's one of my. That's quite a long answer. I think the other thing I would say is we also need to sort of remember that pupils are learning science for an awfully long time. They're starting in primary, they're going all the way up to year 11. And so the question is, well, why don't they know more? Why can't they do more? And, one reason for that is that they are forgetting a lot of what they've learned, or that they didn't understand it in the first place. And so that's another side of that coin as well that I think needs to be explored, because, when you look at the what pupils in year 11 can do, and remember, it's not always, they're not leaving school always with a really good understanding of science. And I think the data I showed at the beginning alludes to some of that. So that's my answer. Have you got any follow-up things you want to say to that?
No, I appreciate what you said. Certainly, I know science in primary schools, obviously, there's a squeeze there too, and I imagine they have their similar sort of battles about prioritising things like English and maths, because I know that that matters a great deal. But I guess, yes, I'm reassured to know at least that it could be explored as one of the options. I think professionally what I tend to do is say, well, I don't think I can use that as a reason. As much as I think it has an impact, I'd rather look for things that I can solve and make gains on. And I sort of push it to the back of my mind. I'm just reassured, I suppose, that they would bear that in mind, because we do feel the pressure and the pace and the rush. And we do feel we're excluding some students who would need that time, if they've got processing, if they more slowly process material and we have to race through.
I think what inspectors are doing is they're trying to understand the reasons for something. So it's not simply that you don't allocate 6 hours to triple science, therefore it is bad. It is more nuanced to it. It's really trying to understand what are the barriers, and of course curriculum time could be one of them, especially if you found out it was somehow discriminating against a particular group of pupils. But thank you for the question. That was a great question. Okay, S. O'Neill, do you want to ask your question?
Hi Jasper, can you hear me okay?
Hi, I can hear you. Hi.
Hi, brilliant. Yeah, I guess I'm not sure if I put it very clearly there. I guess what I'm wondering, I'm the lead practitioner for our trust again down in Plymouth. You've got a lot of activity for Plymouth down here, and we are at the minute trying to push on aligning our curriculum, aligning assessments, sharing what we're doing well, more than we have been. we've got some major issues with that, in that there's a real difference across schools in the structure, the curriculum they have, and the structure. So, time dedicated in each year group to science. And I guess what I'm interested in is your and Ofsted's opinion on, if you looked at us as part of a trust, what would the expectation be there on how aligned we are and how we're working towards alignment?
Yeah, I don't think there's any position on alignment. It's about the impact of what's happening. So, I mean, for example, let's say you took a model where the trust had a mandated curriculum that schools had to do, but then during the deep dive in science, it was clear that this curriculum did not match the time for the schools, the actual teaching time, for example. Then that would alert you to something's not quite right, and you'd want to find out a little bit more about that. So I think it's not about the actual process, is it mandated or not, but it's about, does it fit, does it lead to pupils studying an ambitious curriculum and making progress against it. So I don't think there are any hardline sort of features, if you like, because that's not part. If you look at, if we look at the education inspection framework, that's not part of the criteria of quality of education. But it would raise questions around leadership and management in terms of how why is a school implementing a curriculum that it doesn't have sufficient time for.
Yeah, well, my point, I guess, is we are being encouraged into trust, but actually getting the benefit from that involves us working together. That becomes very, very difficult when we have such different structures. And as you say, if we are trying to get a good, coherent curriculum which links all those things together, it's very, very difficult when we're working to different structures. And as you say, I think we can't really argue that we have a coherent curriculum if we are all trying to work the same one under a different structure.
Yeah. So I don't think there's anything specifically in relation to the handbook, but I think it. If on the ground you what would you? I suppose the question is, what would you see? What would the inspectors see on the ground? And if they're seeing that there's not enough time to teach content and it's just being raced through, for example, then that's a problem for quality of education. So I think that's the lens I would look at it through, is the quality of education judgment and what inspectors would see.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Right. What time are we finishing?
We are officially finishing 5 minutes ago, but if you'd like to answer one or two more questions, that would be great. Thank you.
I'm happy to answer another one. Just trying to find them because of you team schools. Okay, so there's a question around E. Bishop.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Excellent. I'm quite interested in your statement about excluding pupils from part of the curriculum and that everyone should have as much of the curriculum available to them. We've recently switched all of our students in an entire year group for everyone doing triple science, and it's had a really positive effect. I just wondered what the Ofsted view on all students studying triple would be.
So that's a move you've made, is it? You've moved everybody to triple?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think Ofsted doesn't have a view per se about triple, not triple, but I think, so the questions I would be interested in exploring or thinking about with the subject leader, I'd want to know, why, what was the reasoning for that decision? What does the curriculum look like? Because, is there enough time for this? Where does the planning start? Is it starting in year 7? Are you seeing that some pupils are disproportionately struggling because of the demand? That doesn't necessarily mean it would happen. And I've got lots of evidence to say it wouldn't happen, but that would be something that we could look at. What are the advantages? What do pupils think? So I think talking to pupils, what do they feel? Do they feel that this is really ambitious and exciting to be part of? One of the problems with triple science we see in the literature is the negative aspects of triple science is when you select and people don't get it, so that they feel, okay, I wasn't selected for triple science, and therefore science isn't for me. And that's viewed as why triple science is a problem. And there's research from Louise Archer to talk about that. But I think what you've done is you've removed that choice, really.
It's not in the option block.
Yeah, and I think that you get around that problem, don't you? Because no one's having that feeling now. Is that right?
Yes, totally.
Yeah. So I think it's really interesting. I wish you a lot of luck with it, because it's not it's not the model that most schools use. But I don't think it's not Ofsted would come in and say this is a problem or this is a great thing. They'd want to understand leaders' rationale and how it's playing out on the ground. But it sounds like you've done a lot of thinking around that. You're aware of why you've done it. So
multiple reasons for it, including just simple timetabling and the way that having it as an option completely shifted the setting for maths and English, and it's a whole school decision actually. And I just was interested in your views. That was all. But thank you.
One question they might ask, it's coming in my head now, is what that means that they can't do. So does that mean there's a subject now that they don't have access to?
No.
Okay. Yeah. So those are the sort of questions, and I think with all of the questions I'm being asked in the chat bar, I think very few does Ofsted have a view one way or the other. We're simply, when you look at the quality of education judgment, that's what guides us, and we would just have questions to try and understand why something is happening, and whether that has implications or not.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. No. We've some really
exhausted our time.
Yeah. Some really great questions, though. I think they're really getting at some of the real complexities of this work in terms of how it happens in schools, and implementing some of this in terms of disciplinary knowledge. Again, I would say that this review is a conception of high quality science education. It's not a list of things schools need to implement immediately at all. That's not its purpose. So please see it in that way. That I hope it is helpful for you as you think about your curriculum in school.
Right, thank you very, very much, Jasper. I've got lots of feedback about how informative it is and how interested everybody is in what you've got to say. I will send out a feedback questionnaire along with your answer to the primary school question, probably the early part of next week. So if anyone's got any burning questions in the meantime, please do let me have them, and I'll forward them on to Jasper for you, and maybe they can be included in that. But thank you so very much, Jasper. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, very much, everybody. Have a good evening.